thought I was coming home to an empty house. Daniel had left for Seattle 3 days ago. A conference, he said, patting my shoulder at the airport with that distracted warmth he'd grown so comfortable with. And I had spent the last 72 hours quietly, gratefully alone. But as I turned my car into the driveway on that Thursday evening, the headlights swept across the facade of our house, and I saw it, a silhouette behind the frosted glass of the living room window, a shape, still, watching. My hands froze on the wheel, and for a long, suspended second, I simply could not breathe. It was not a burglar. That was the first thing I told myself, even as my foot hovered over the gas pedal. Burglars don't stand in the middle of your living room like they own the place. Burglars don't turn on all the lights and draw the curtains just so. And burglars, I realized, with a sick, cold drop of my stomach, don't have a key. The key that I had never, not once, given to anyone except Daniel. The silhouette moved, unhurried and completely at ease, and I recognized the set of those shoulders, that tilt of the head, that particular deliberate posture that always made my skin prickle, even when I couldn't name the reason why. It was Margaret, my mother-in-law, and she was moving through my house as though she had always lived there, as though I were the one who had arrived uninvited. Daniel and I had been married for 4 years when the silhouette appeared in my window. 4 years that I would have, without hesitation, described as good. Not perfect, not the breathless stuff of movies, but steady and warm and full of small, reliable joys. We had met at a mutual friend's wedding, which felt embarrassingly cliché but also felt like ours. A small private joke we carried into every anniversary dinner and every toast. He was a structural engineer. I was a tax attorney, which made people at dinner parties give a polite, pained smile and immediately begin talking to someone else. I didn't mind. I had always preferred the work to the attention it earned me. There is a particular satisfaction in being underestimated in your profession. People tell you things they wouldn't tell someone who frightened them, and in tax law, what people tell you is almost always more important than what they put on paper. Our house, my house, technically, purchased 2 years before the wedding with the inheritance from my grandmother, was a pale blue Craftsman on a quiet street lined with oak trees so old they had lifted the sidewalk into uneven, heaving waves. I loved every imperfect inch of it, the creaking third stair, the kitchen window that fogged on cold mornings, the backyard garden I had planted the first summer with more enthusiasm than skill. The roses survived. The tomatoes did not. I kept planting them every year anyway. There is something about a thing that refuses to grow exactly as you want it to that feels honest, almost admirable. I respected the tomatoes for their stubbornness. The house was mine in the most fundamental sense, not just legally, not just financially, but in the way that certain places absorb the particular quality of a person's solitude and give it back to them when they walk through the door. My grandmother had chosen it for me, in a way. The money had come from her, earned over 60 years of careful, unglamorous work, and she had told me the last time I saw her that she hoped I would use it to build something that was just mine, something that couldn't be taken. I had built this, the pale blue house, the lopsided roses, the third stair that sang when I stepped on it at midnight. Margaret had never liked the house. She said it was charming, which in her mouth always carried the very faint, very deliberate suggestion of something quaint and slightly outgrown. She preferred her own world. A new construction condo 40 minutes north, all clean granite countertops and recessed lighting, and the particular, airless sterility of a place where no child had ever run through a hallway or knocked a glass off a table. She came to our house for Sunday dinners approximately once a month, arriving in a cloud of her signature perfume, something heavy and floral, expensive in the way of things chosen to announce themselves, and sitting at our table with a posture that somehow communicated, without anything so crude as a direct statement, that she was doing us a favor by being there. I had learned, in 4 years, to absorb this. Daniel loved his mother with the helpless, total devotion of a man who had been raised by a single parent, who sacrificed everything and built her sacrifice into the very foundation of how he understood himself and what he owed her. I understood that. I respected it, the way you respect a fact about a person that you cannot change and have no real right to demand they change. Margaret herself was not obviously monstrous. She was 63, elegant in a way that required considerable daily maintenance, with hair that had been silver since her early 50s, and which she wore with the absolute confidence of a woman who had long ago decided the terms on which the world would look at her. She was sharp and genuinely funny when she wanted to be. She remembered birthdays and sent real cards, handwritten in a firm, slightly old-fashioned script, not only for Christmas and Easter, but for the anniversary of my grandmother's death. A gesture so precise and personal that it had genuinely moved me the first year. I had mistaken precision for warmth. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that someone can be extraordinarily skilled at the gestures of warmth without ever generating any actual heat. The cracks, when they came, were small enough to explain away individually. That is the particular genius of a careful person. They don't show you the whole plan at once. They show you one corner of it, slightly, and then they wait to see whether you are the kind of person who reaches for the rest or who lets it go. It started at Sunday dinner in February, about 8 months before that evening in the driveway, when Margaret asked, in the idle conversational voice of someone making small talk over cleared plates, whether the mortgage on the house was in both of our names. She was helping me carry dishes to the kitchen, which was itself unusual enough that I noted it, although I noted it the way you note the color of a car that cuts you off, briefly, without consequence. "It's my house," I said with a smile that I hoped communicated the strangeness of the question without directly accusing her of asking a strange question. "I bought it before Daniel and I were married. The mortgage is only in my name." She nodded slowly, picking up a wine glass and holding it to the overhead light as though checking for water spots. Her face was entirely neutral. "Of course," she said. "I just wondered, with property values the way they are in this neighborhood." She set the glass down and looked at me, and her smile reached precisely as far as her lips. "It must be worth quite a bit now." I told her I hadn't had it appraised recently. She said that was smart. "No point in knowing what you're sitting on until you're ready to do something about it," and changed the subject with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had already received what they came for. I told myself it was nothing. Property values were a normal topic. People talked about property values. I washed the wine glass and put it away and forgot about it, or told myself I forgot about it, which is not quite the same thing. A month later, she asked Daniel about the title deed. I only knew because Daniel mentioned it at breakfast, offhandedly, in the distracted tone he used for things he had already processed and filed under not worth worrying about. "Mom was asking about the deed," he said, eyes on his phone. I told her it was just in your name. I put down my coffee cup with a small, precise sound. "Why is she asking about the deed?" He looked up. "She's just curious. You know how she is. She likes to know how things are arranged." He gave me the look then, the one that meant, "Please don't make this into a thing." A look I knew so well by then that I could feel it coming before his face fully formed it. And I felt the familiar, exhausting internal negotiation. Was I overreacting? Was I constructing a problem from materials that didn't warrant it? I decided I was. I picked up my coffee and said nothing, and the stone that had briefly appeared in my chest dissolved back into ordinary morning quiet. But the questions continued. In March, Margaret asked Daniel, during a phone call I half heard while passing the hallway, whether they had ever discussed adding her name to the property as a family asset for everyone's security. In April, she asked me directly, pleasantly, over coffee she'd made herself in my kitchen without asking, whether I had ever thought about putting the house into a family trust. She had a friend, she said, who could recommend a very good estate attorney. It would protect everyone, she said. She said everyone in a particular way, gently, with a small tilt of her head, as though she were doing me a favor by suggesting it. And I noticed the way she did not include herself in the everyone, while making it very clear that she was the one doing the protecting. I started paying attention differently after that, not obsessively. I want to be honest about the difference between a woman who is losing her mind and a woman who is beginning to see clearly. I simply began to notice things I had previously filtered out. Daniel started taking phone calls in the car, in the backyard, in the bathroom with the door closed and the water running, which was new and which he would have no reason to explain unless he suspected I was listening. He was a half-beat slower to answer simple questions. He smiled at me the same as always. He kissed me on the forehead when he left for work the same as always. But something behind his eyes had gone quiet in a way that I could not name and could not quite prove. A particular quality of absence in a person who is still physically present, like a window that has been painted shut from the inside. One night in September, I woke at 2 a.m. to find the bed empty beside me. I lay in the dark for a moment listening, and I heard it. The low, deliberate murmur of his voice from somewhere below, the kitchen or the living room, measured and continuous in the way of a real conversation rather than a brief phone check. I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, he's talking to her. I don't know how I knew with such certainty. I only know that the knowing arrived whole and settled, without the usual possibility of explaining it away. I did not go downstairs. I lay in the dark telling myself it was nothing. Adult children call their mothers. There are no rules about what hour. I was catastrophizing. I was tired and anxious and making a conspiracy from ordinary loneliness. And eventually I fell back into a thin, restless sleep. But the knowing stayed in my chest like a stone. And the next morning, looking at him over my coffee cup, I could not find even the edges of what I had always thought I knew about my husband. The Seattle conference was Daniel's idea. He mentioned it weeks in advance, in the matter-of-fact way of a recurring annual obligation, and I had no reason to question it. I had, in fact, quiet, private reasons to welcome it. 3 days alone in my house, my own rhythms, my own silence, my own air. I needed the space without being able to say so, without it becoming a conversation I didn't have the energy for. The drive home from the airport had felt like setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I was carrying. Windows cracked, October air cold and sharp and clean, the particular relief of a person who has been holding their breath for weeks. I spent the day working from home, a conference call in the morning, contract review in the afternoon, the kind of quiet, productive solitude that I had once taken entirely for granted. By 5 o'clock, the light was going low and amber through the kitchen window, and I made myself a cup of tea and stood watching the garden, the late roses still holding on, and thought about nothing in particular. I texted Daniel, "Quiet day here. You?" He replied quickly, "Good. Long sessions. Miss you." 4 words. The kind of text that carries weight precisely because of its brevity, because after 4 years, you know what a person means when they don't elaborate. I thought it felt warm. I thought it felt normal. I put my phone in my pocket and drove to the grocery store and bought bread and wine and the good pasta, and I let myself feel, for the first time in months, something close to calm. The headlights swept across the frosted glass, and the calm stopped like a cut wire. I sat in the dark car and made myself think. Margaret had no key. I had never given her a key. I had replaced the deadbolt 2 years ago quietly with a new lock whose keys I had accounted for. Mine, Daniel's spare in the desk drawer, and one with a neighbor 3 houses down for emergencies. 3 keys, all accounted for. Except that Daniel's spare was in the desk drawer, and Daniel was 3,000 miles away in Seattle, and the spare was either still in the desk drawer or it was not. I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sat holding the phone and staring at the lit windows of my own house, and I felt it arrive. Not panic, not yet, but something colder and more permanent than panic. The understanding that this had been arranged, that his absence was not incidental, that the conference in Seattle and the empty house and the key that should have been in his desk drawer were all part of something I had not been invited to know about. I got out of the car. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open with the groceries still in my arms, and the smell of my house hit me first. Warm wood, old coffee, the faint green breath of the plants on the windowsill. And then, beneath that, layering over it, her perfume. Heavy and floral. The kind that announces itself in a room and doesn't apologize. The kind that, once you've identified it, you cannot stop smelling. Margaret was standing in the center of my living room. She had poured herself a glass of my wine, the good bottle I had been saving, the one from the back of the rack. And she was wearing reading glasses I'd never seen before, small and silver, and she looked absolutely at home in a way that made something in my chest go very cold and very still. On the coffee table in front of her, open and clearly read, was a manila folder I recognized before I had finished stepping through the door. Thick, cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges. Daniel kept it in the back of his home office desk. I had seen it a dozen times over the years without looking at the contents, trusting, the way you trust the locked drawer of someone you love. Inside that folder was the deed to my house. She looked up at me over the rim of her reading glasses and did not look even slightly surprised. "Emma," she said in the warm, measured voice of a woman who had planned exactly this moment. "Darling, I'm so glad you're home." She took a small, unhurried sip of my wine. "We have quite a lot to talk about." I set the groceries down on the floor beside the door, not on the counter, not on the table, on the floor, because my hands needed to be empty and because some instinct I couldn't have explained told me not to walk further into my own living room. Not yet. Not until I understood what I was walking into. The paper bag sagged sideways and the wine bottle clinked against the tile, and Margaret watched the whole small sequence with the patient, settled attention of someone who has waited a long time for a moment and intends to be fully present for it. "How did you get in?" I said. It was not a question. The flatness of my own voice surprised me. No pitch, no tremor, just 4 words arranged in a row, like stones, laid down one by one. Margaret tilted her head with what I had once interpreted as thoughtfulness and now recognized as the particular, practiced pause of someone who speaks strategically. "Daniel gave me a key," she said, "months ago. He thought it would be practical in case of emergencies." She set her wine glass down on the coffee table, on top of the folder, on top of the deed to my house, without a coaster, and folded her hands in her lap. Her posture was immaculate. Her reading glasses caught the lamplight. "This is an emergency, Emma, of sorts." I looked at the folder beneath her wine glass, and I did not move. The room felt pressurized, the way a room feels during a storm before the storm has technically arrived. The lamp in the corner cast everything in warm amber, and the shadows were long, and the clock above the fireplace ticked with a slow, metronomic patience. And I thought, he gave her a key. Not a copy made in secret, not a theft, a gift, a deliberate, premeditated gift of entry into the space I had bought and built and tended and believed was mine. "What," I said, "are you doing with that folder?" She drew a breath in through her nose and let it out slowly, the exhalation of a woman steeling herself for a difficult but necessary conversation. I had seen her perform this breath before. It meant she was about to say something she had rehearsed. "I've been talking to a real estate attorney," she said, and the words landed so quietly, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment I simply stood there waiting for them to make sense. "This house, the property value, the neighborhood. Emma, you're sitting on an extraordinary asset, and the way it's currently structured with the deed only in your name, in the event of anything, a separation, an illness, a market shift, the family is completely unprotected." She paused. "I can't allow that." The word allow hung in the air between us. I heard it. I let it sit there. "You can't allow it," I repeated. "I'm Daniel's mother," she said, and the warmth in her voice was so perfectly calibrated, gentle, loving, pained, that if I had heard it on a recording, I might have believed it. I have spent 35 years building his security, making sure he had something stable beneath him, and this house, Emma, this is the most significant asset in his life. It should be in his name, or in a family trust that protects everyone's interest. Not because I don't trust you, darling, but because I trust the law, and the law needs to be arranged properly." She reached forward and lifted her wine glass off the folder. Then she lifted the folder itself and opened it, and she removed from inside it a document I had never seen. Thick, cream white, bound with a binder clip, printed on the kind of heavyweight paper that professional offices use. She set it on the coffee table and slid it toward the edge closest to me. "Daniel and I had this drafted," she said, "an amendment to the property deed, adding Daniel as a co-owner with right of survivorship and transferring a protective interest to a family trust." She looked at me steadily. "It only requires your signature." The floor did not literally move. I want to be very clear about that. I am a tax attorney. I have spent my career inside documents and language and the paper structures of what people own and owe and intend. And I know the difference between a physical sensation and the metaphor for one. The floor did not move. But my vision went strange for a moment, a brief total narrowing, as though the room had contracted to the size of that document on my coffee table. And I heard my own blood in my ears, and my hands, still empty at my sides, began to shake. I walked to the coffee table and picked up the document and read it. The first page, the second, the third. I read it the way I read everything, slowly, entirely, without skipping. And with every paragraph, the shaking in my hands grew worse, and the cold in my chest spread upward until I could feel it in my jaw. The amendment was real. It was professionally drafted and legally structured and entirely correct in its language. And it would, if signed, convert my house, the house I bought with my grandmother's money, the house I had owned for 6 years before I even knew Daniel's last name, into a joint asset of our marriage, which would then be placed into a family trust in which Margaret held a trustee position. Trustee, my mother-in-law. Trustee of the house my grandmother's 60 years of labor had bought for me. I looked up. Who drafted this? An attorney I use for my own estate planning. He's very thorough. A small smile. Very discreet. And Daniel. I said it not as a question. I could hear the change in my own voice. Something had gone cold in it. Glacially, permanently cold, the way water goes cold when the temperature drops below a certain threshold and stays there. Daniel helped you draft this. She did not hesitate. That was when I understood completely what I was dealing with. Not impulsivity, not a misguided maternal instinct, but a plan. A long, careful, patient plan executed by two people who loved each other in the way of people whose love is a closed circuit that doesn't require anyone else's participation to sustain itself. "We've been discussing it for a while," she said. "He wanted you to understand it was the right thing before we approached you. He wanted to find the right moment. I'm afraid I lost patience." She looked at me with something that, in a different context, might have been genuine. "This is the right thing, Emma. For everyone." I put the document down. I picked up my phone. I called Daniel. This time he answered on the second ring, which told me everything his voice hadn't yet had the chance to conceal. He answered too quickly, with the particular alertness of a man who has been waiting by his phone for exactly this call, sitting somewhere in Seattle, or wherever he actually was, knowing that this moment would come, and having decided already how he intended to navigate it. He said. The nickname landed wrong, softer than the situation warranted, an instrument of intimacy deployed as a buffer. "Your mother is in our house," I said. "She has a document that you co-drafted with her attorney. She wants me to sign over a trustee interest in my house to her." I paused. "Tell me this is not what I think it is." Silence? The particular silence of a person who has rehearsed a speech and is now deciding whether to deliver it or abandon it. Then, it's not what it sounds like. It's protective. It protects both of us. If something happened to you, to either of us, the house would be safe. It's responsible planning, Emma, not Daniel. The single word stopped him. "You gave her a key to my house." A pause. "For emergencies. You went to Seattle knowing she was going to come here while you were gone and present me with this document alone." Silence again. The quality of this silence was different. It had weight, The weight of a man who knows he's been seen and is calculating whether there is any version of the next sentence that will change what has already been seen. He chose. I didn't think it would happen like this. Mom said she'd wait until... How long? I said. He stopped. How long have you been planning this? He said nothing for so long that I checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. Then quietly, Emma, let's talk about this when I'm home. It's more complicated than... I ended the call. I set my phone on the table beside the document, face down, and I looked at Margaret, who had been watching me throughout this exchange with the careful stillness of someone who is very good at waiting and who knows that silence, correctly deployed, is a form of pressure. Her wine glass was in her hand again. Her posture had not changed. She looked, I thought, like someone who had already decided the outcome of this conversation and was simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. He's known for over a year, I said. Not a question. He's wanted to protect his family, she said. That's all he's ever wanted. I picked up the document and walked to the kitchen and placed it on the counter. Then I went to the cabinet under the sink and retrieved the small, fire-resistant document box I kept there. The one containing my grandmother's will, the original deed, my own attorney's contact card, and several other things I had placed there years ago, out of a vague instinct toward preparedness that I had never fully examined. I retrieved the contact card and I called my attorney, Patricia, a woman I had worked with through the entire property purchase, who answered on the third ring even at 6:45 in the evening, because Patricia was the kind of attorney who understood that the people who needed her most never needed her at convenient hours. I need you to do something for me, I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. Tonight, if possible. I went back to the living room while Patricia talked. Margaret had not moved. There was something almost admirable about her composure, the way an adversary's genuine skill can command a reluctant respect, even as you are actively working to defeat them. She watched me return, and her eyes went briefly to the card in my hand, and something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not quite, but the first small recalibration of a strategist who has just registered that the board has been reset. I want you to understand something, I said, and I stood in front of my own fireplace in my own home, and I did not raise my voice, because the kind of anger I felt by then had burned entirely through heat and arrived somewhere on the other side of it, somewhere colder and cleaner and more precise. This house was purchased with money my grandmother earned over 60 years of her life. It is mine. It is mine in my name and in my deed, and in my law, and in every category of possession that exists. I looked at her steadily. I did not sign your document. I will not sign your document. The document will not be presented to me again, and you are going to leave my house. She set the wine glass down with a small, definitive click. Emma. Her voice had changed register. Softer, more private. The voice of someone preparing to be wounded. You're being emotional. I understand that. This is a shock. But you have to consider... I spoke to my attorney, I said. She is reviewing the document tonight. If there are any issues with the way it was drafted, any signatures obtained under pressure, any misrepresentation of intent, she will be speaking to the relevant parties by morning. I held the card up briefly. Not a threat. A fact. You presented a legal document to me alone, in my home, without my attorney present, using a key obtained through my husband without my knowledge. My attorney is aware of all of this. For the first time, Margaret's composure showed its seam. It was small, a tightening at the corner of her mouth, the faintest withdrawal behind her eyes. But it was real, and I saw it, and we both knew that I saw it. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then softly, with the precise calibration of a woman deploying her last instrument, I only want what's best for Daniel. I know, I said. That's the problem. She left. She left without the document, which I retained, and without finishing the wine, and she left the way powerful people leave situations that have not resolved in their favor, with a great deal of controlled dignity, that is, if you know how to read it, indistinguishable from rage. I stood in my living room and listened to her heels on the porch, the car door, the engine. I waited until the sound had completely disappeared. Then I sat down on the floor with my back against the sofa and my hands on my knees, and I breathed. Daniel came home 2 days later, not from Seattle, as Patricia's preliminary checks had already established, but from a town 3 hours north, where he had been staying with a college friend who didn't know, or claimed not to know, what Daniel had set in motion before leaving. He came through the front door with his bag over his shoulder and the expression of a man who has spent 48 hours deciding between two versions of himself and hasn't yet committed to either. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee and the copy of the document Patricia had annotated in red. "Sit down," I said. He sat. He looked at the document. He looked at my face. He put his bag on the floor and sat very still. I told him what I knew, which by then was considerable. Patricia had made calls. A contact at the county recorder's office had confirmed that an inquiry, not yet a formal filing but an inquiry, had been made about the process for adding a co-owner to an existing residential deed. The inquiry had been made 6 weeks ago by Margaret's attorney on behalf of a client described only as a family member. Daniel's hands, flat on the table, went very still as I spoke. His eyes didn't quite meet mine, but didn't quite leave me either. They rested somewhere in the middle distance, on some point in the air between us that was easier than my face. When I finished, he said, "I never wanted you to get hurt." I looked at him for a long time. At the face I had woken up next to for 4 years, the face I had believed I knew completely, the face that had kissed me on the forehead at the airport and said, "I'll miss you," and driven away to a hotel 3 hours north to wait out the consequences of what he had helped arrange. "What did you want then?" I said. He couldn't answer that, or wouldn't. The difference, I had finally learned, mattered less than I'd once thought. The legal process took 4 months. Patricia filed a formal complaint regarding the unauthorized inquiry on the deed, which triggered a review by the State Bar Association of Margaret's attorney's conduct. The attorney, facing a potential disciplinary proceeding, declined to represent Margaret further in any matter involving our property. Margaret retained new counsel. Her new counsel, upon reviewing the full record, advised her that she had no viable legal avenue to any interest in a property purchased before the marriage with non-marital funds, and that pursuing the matter further would constitute harassment as defined under applicable statute. Margaret did not pursue the matter further. Her wine glass sat in my sink for a week before I washed it and put it away, and then, one afternoon, I took it out again and held it and thought about what it had contained and what it had sat on top of, and then I put it in the recycling bin. Some objects retain the feeling of the hands that have held them. Daniel and I are no longer married. That is the part of this story I tell with the least drama, because it deserves the least drama. Not every ending requires a scene. We separated in January, 6 weeks after he came home from wherever he had actually been, and the separation was quiet and honest and in its way kind. He was not a villain. He was a man who loved his mother more than he had the courage to love his wife, and who had convinced himself for long enough that those two things were compatible. They were not. The house remained in my name. The deed was never altered. The document Margaret had placed on my coffee table was shredded in Patricia's office on a Tuesday afternoon, and I signed the order myself and watched the machine take it and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not triumph, exactly. Quieter than triumph. More durable. It is May now. The oak trees on my street are in full extravagant leaf, and the sidewalk is still heaving and imperfect and completely unchanged. I had the third stair fixed in March and then immediately regretted it, and then came to terms with the absence of the creak the way you come to terms with most small losses. Not quickly, but eventually, and with the understanding that what you miss is not the thing itself, but the proof that the house knew you were there. The roses came back, as they always do. I planted tomatoes again, more out of stubbornness than optimism, in 4 containers along the south fence where the afternoon light is best. 2 of them appear to be surviving. Patricia and I had lunch last week. She ordered the good wine, which I had told her was extravagant for a Tuesday, and she had looked at me over her glass and said, entirely seriously, that she had spent 30 years watching people fail to protect what was theirs, and that surviving it gracefully was always worth celebrating. I thought about my grandmother. 60 years of careful, unglamorous work, the explicit hope that I would build something that couldn't be taken. I thought about the pale blue house and the tilting sidewalk and the folder of documents in the fire-resistant box under the kitchen sink. I thought, she would have liked Patricia. There is a version of this story I could tell where the ending is simple, where the bad people lose and the good people win, and the house stands unchanged, and the heroine walks into a golden future entirely unmarked by what she survived. That version would be easier to tell. It would also be a lie. I lost a marriage. I lost 4 years of believing I knew someone I didn't know, and the particular grief of that, not the loss of the person themselves, but the loss of the version of them you had trusted, is a real grief, slow and unglamorous, and not over. Some mornings I still wake early and lie in the bed that is now entirely mine and look at the ceiling and feel the weight of all of it. The silhouette in the window and Margaret's voice saying, "We have quite a lot to talk about," and Daniel's hands flat on the kitchen table going still. But then I get up. I make coffee. I stand at the kitchen window that fogs on cold mornings, and I watch the garden, and I drink my coffee in the house that is mine, legally, documented, indisputably, permanently mine. And the light comes through the glass the same amber it always has. Some things hold, I have learned, even when you cannot name all the reasons why. My grandmother knew it. Now I know it too. A house that has been fought for is different from a house that was simply given. You know every inch of it differently. Every room carries the memory of what it cost to keep it. And that memory is not a shadow. It is a kind of warmth, the warmth of something genuinely earned, genuinely yours. The tomatoes this year will probably not survive the summer. I will plant them again next spring anyway. There is something about a thing that refuses to grow exactly as you want it to, that feels honest, almost admirable. I have decided that I am that kind of person now. The kind who keeps planting, not because the outcome is certain, but because the trying is the whole point. The morning light is coming through the window. The coffee is good. The house is quiet and entirely mine. That is enough.